Greetings everyone, my name is Joey, and today's video is going to be my Battlefield build walkthrough. Basically it's just a video to show the steps and methods that I use to create this project, and possibly give insight and tips if anyone's planning something like this on their own. So this was day one. This is me taking home the insulation board and the plywood. The insulation board that I used was $20 a sheet, and it was 4 feet by 8 feet from Home Depot, and it was the 1 inch thick, and the plywood that I had cut was I believe a 1/2 inch thick plywood there, and I just glued it to the plywood with wood glue, and I will have all the links down below for all the materials that I used. So yeah, here's me planning the initial layout, just kind of seeing how I want everything to flow. And let's jump right into Terradrome Mountain. Terradrome Mountain was the first piece that I built. I wanted it to be the center and focal point, and I built everything around it. So this is me planning the, at this stage I'm just kind of stacking boards to see what the height that I want, but also kind of a basic shape. And once I get the basic shape, I just take it into my garage and I glue it all together with the wood glue, put a bunch of heavy stuff on it, and then by the next day it's ready to start carving. For the actual carving process, I just use an 8-inch kitchen knife that I would just kind of wiggle into the board and then break it off at irregular angles just to give it that rock shape. I will make a future video showing the actual method itself, because I do plan expansion methods or expansion projects for this. I have a jungle terrain that I'm going to build and an Arctic terrain that I'm going to build in the future, and I will actually record those. So here I'm testing out the Lazy Susan, making sure that the Terradrome can spin. I thought that was a pretty fun idea. And here's the back end of the Terradrome Mountain that yeah, you can see all the shreds of insulation board on the bottom there. Like it makes a pretty big mess, but I'm pretty happy with the overall results. I find that the insulation board is really forgiving. If you have any problems, if you make a mistake, you can glue some extra insulation board on there, and you can cut it like you never even made a mistake in the first place. And if you do, you've got the Sculpt-A-Mold that can back you up. So the white stuff here is Sculpt-A-Mold, which is basically a paper mache, and yeah, also super forgiving in the crafting process. I used it primarily to give the rock surfaces texture, but also you can see here I've got several layers of that 1-inch board glued on top of each other, and I also used it to kind of mask all the different layers, so it doesn't just look like layer on top of layer on top of layer. It still kind of does in the end, but not as much as it would have if you hadn't used the Sculpt-A-Mold. So here I'm gluing the ballast, which is just basically gravel. I did have someone ask me why I choose to glue the gravel on before I paint, and basically I want all of the rocks to have the same color, and I found the ballast was a little more chalky gray that I wanted, if that makes sense. But I just glue that on with Elmer's glue. I find that works the best. The Elmer's glue kind of dries to where you can't even see it at all, whereas if you use the wood glue, it dries really thick. So getting into the painting process, I painted every single set piece the same way. I start with my base coat, which is just solid black, and it usually takes about 2 coats to really get into every little nook and cranny there. And then lots and lots of layers of dry brushing. So this is after the dry brushing here, and that's going to be your base coat, your dark gray dry brushing, your light gray dry brushing. Then I do a brown for all the dirts and just kind of like a dirty, muddy surface on the side. And then the very final one, which I found was crucial, was doing a bright white, which really kind of highlighted all the angles in the rock. And that's when it really, for me anyway, really kind of pops, and I start liking the project itself. I keep having to remind myself to trust the process. And here's a closer look at how that ends up. And again, I think the white just really kind of brings out all those rock faces. And you can see the Lazy Susan on top. And this is during the flocking. It's still drying at this point, so you can see all the glue lines. I'd never done anything like this before, and I really love flocking. I found it also to be very forgiving. So the whole project is fairly forgiving. I used the Woodland Scenics turf, and I used two colors. I used like a light green and then a brown, and you can blend those, and you can kind of see the blending there. I used a brown for the more center areas, which I figured would have higher traffic, and then the lighter greens on the edges, and I really like the end result there. And then the next section I did was G.I. Joe headquarters. So again, here's me just kind of planning my layout, seeing how I want the terrain to flow. That's my wife in the background there, instrumental in helping me plan all of this. So I'll just put down blocks of insulation board, getting heights and levels and kind of getting an idea of how I want things to flow and how I want things to look. And that's kind of how I start my process. I don't ever draw anything out. I'm just kind of glue it together and see what happens kind of crafter. Initially, you can see from this picture, I had the surrounding area of the headquarters to be mountains. I decided I didn't like the mountain look. It did look cool, but the problem was that it felt too enclosed. So I decided to go with an actual fence, which was a lot more work, but I really love the end process. Here you can see I've sculpted the ramps mostly out of the board already, and I fill in the rest of that with that Sculptamold. And also all the marker that I've drawn on there, that's just kind of me planning out where I'm going to put stuff. And that big black knife that you see on the board there, that's the knife that I used to carve this entire project. And then this is after I've added some of the Sculptamold to the front of the base there. And again, I'm using that to fill in, to kind of smooth out the rock face itself, give it texture, but also kind of hide all of those various layers of board that I've glued together. Here I'm testing the stairs that I 3D printed. I found a file for stairs. It was for tabletop miniature games, so I had to upscale it. I believe it was like 115% to get to the size of the 3 and 3.75 Joes. And again, here in this picture, you can see the Sculptamold really helping kind of mask all those different layers of insulation board that are glued together. And just like Terradrome Mountain, I start with my heavy base coat, usually two coats of black, just to kind of get in all the crevices there, especially when you're gluing the gravel together. It takes a little bit more paint to get in between those. And then lots of dry brushing, again, with the dark gray, a lighter gray, the brown, and then the white to bring out all the highlights. This one was a little different just because I used a lot of brown for the ground where the tanks and stuff would be rolling through. And then after the flocking, now this is where I started installing the fence. The fence post itself was made from galvanized wire that I just kind of cut to length and glued to the board. And then the chain link itself was made from screen door mesh that we just glued onto the posts with UV resin, which I had never used before. But now I don't know how I ever crafted anything without it. UV resin is basically magic. It was really, really fun project. Thank my wife for that. She makes a lot of jewelry with UV resin, and it was her idea to glue the fence on there. Fun fact about the military sign there, that's an actual military sign that's from Area 51. I found a picture on the internet, and I just printed it to thumbnail size. The barbed wire around the top, that is just jewelry wire that I coiled and just affixed to the top of the fence there. So the next section that I made was the landing pad. I didn't have a lot of not a lot of space left over at this point on this side of the table, so I kind of had to make it as condensed as possible. So I decided to go up several layers and then just kind of embed those stairs there. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out overall. You can see the Sculptamold there, and then after the project was finished, you can see the rock face again. That white paint really sets off the rock face and is, in my opinion, what gives it a really nice pop. So this is what the project looked like at this point. And I think I have a little video kind of taking a quick look at how my setup was at that point in the whole process. So then the final section that I made was the beach landing. I saved it for last because it's the largest section, the heaviest section, and also it was going to be the most labor-intensive section. Again, here's just the planning, throwing a bunch of shapes on there, seeing what kind of flows, and then gluing that all down. You can see with the Sharpie marks on the table there, where I was planning to do rock versus water. And then after I've done the initial carving and added a lot of Sculptamold, I think I had ordered like a 50-pound box and I used half of it. So it was a lot of Sculptamold, but it is really easy to use and probably one of my new favorite things now. So again, base coat of black and then lots of dry brushing. And then this is after the flocking and after I've added all the sand. I did the sand basically like I did the flocking, where I add a lot of Elmer's glue to the table and just dump the sand on. Once that dries, then I add another, I give it another coat of like the watered down glue from the spray bottle to really affix everything. But then after that dried, I added a dark wash on top of it because the resin would encase the sand, but it wouldn't give it that wet sand look. So I went ahead and did a dark wash up to where I thought the water would kind of come up on the shore, and of course, where would the underwater section be? And then this was after we poured the resin. My wife and I used 2 gallons of resin, and it was like a tabletop epoxy resin, and the 2 gallons was not enough. We really underestimated how much we were going to need, but I still ended up liking the final process, so we decided not to add any more. We just made a kind of like a barrier there, taped it off, and then poured the resin. And we added a very, very faint light blue dye to it to kind of give it that dark water feeling. And this is the final result, and I absolutely love it. I've never done anything with resin before. My wife had made resin jewelry, but she had also never made anything to this scale. Pro tip, when you use resin has like an exothermic reaction, which you probably won't notice on smaller projects, but when you're using 2 gallons of it, it puts off a lot of heat, which I was not expecting. Luckily, it didn't affect the insulation board or anything, but there was a point where it started to melt some of the hot glue that I was using to hold those molds in. And then that's what the project looked like pretty much when it was done. The water section ended up being my favorite section. Generally, when you're working with resin, you try to eliminate all the bubbles. I tried to get as many bubbles as possible. I wanted it to look like a really churning ocean, and I'm absolutely thrilled with how it turned out. And that's the finished project. All in all, it took me about 7 months start to finish. Lots of time, lots of fun though, and I'm really happy with the end result. And I figured we can finish up the video here with a lot of close-ups of the Joes in action. So once again, I'd like to thank everyone for watching. I've really enjoyed making this project. I posted my initial video on YouTube thinking no one would ever actually even see it, and it's over 100,000 views, which just blows my mind. And everyone's been super supportive with their comments and their ideas, and I really appreciate it. I had not planned on making any future videos, but now I've got several really exciting videos in the works, all thanks to everyone's support and encouragement. So yeah, thanks again. Stay tuned for some future exciting content, and yeah, yo Joe.